of Duke of Rothesay and the other Scottish titles which I've had the honour to carry for so long, I now pass to Catherine.
There is a document inside Buckingham Palace that very few people have been permitted to read. It carries the king's signature, a royal seal, and language so precise that constitutional advisors spent weeks refining every sentence. And when Charles finally placed his pen down after signing it, the people standing in that room did not celebrate. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that what had just happened would change the shape of the British monarchy for generations. But before the full weight of that moment can be understood, it is necessary to go back to the beginning. Because this document did not appear suddenly. It was the result of months of tension, a single confrontation inside Windsor Castle, and a series of private conversations that the palace had gone to considerable lengths to keep out of the public record. King Charles III had been watching the dynamics inside his own household shift for some time. Since his accession, the question of how authority would eventually move into the next reign had never been far from his advisors' minds. Transition planning, the careful, largely invisible process of preparing royal duties and responsibilities for the next monarch, is among the most sensitive work the palace undertakes. It touches on staff loyalty, public trust, ceremonial influence, and the delicate balance of personalities that a functioning royal household requires. What made the situation in Charles's case more complicated than any purely procedural challenge was that it involved three people he loved, and a conflict he had hoped, for a very long time, he might be able to avoid. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had spent more than a decade building something that is genuinely difficult to manufacture inside any institution: public trust earned through consistency. She had not sought influence through proximity to power or through political maneuvering. She had earned it through restraint, through discipline, through showing up during the most difficult periods of the monarchy's recent history with composure that even her critics found hard to dismiss. By the time Charles began working seriously on the continuity framework, the confidential document defining how royal authority, ceremonial leadership, and household control would pass into William's future reign, Catherine's standing, both inside the palace and among the wider public, had become one of the institution's most significant assets. Commonwealth consultations pointed to her. Household assessments described her. Public confidence data confirmed her. The question was no longer whether she would be central to what came next. The question was what that centrality would mean for the woman who already stood beside the current king. Camilla, queen consort, had arrived at this chapter of her life after a journey that had cost her, and those around her, a great deal. The controversy that surrounded her relationship with Charles, the years of public hostility, the gradual and hard-fought shift toward acceptance, none of that had been simple or painless. What she had earned through those years, or believed she had earned, was a place not merely in the present reign, but in the one that followed it. Her household, her advisors, her circle of trusted allies, these were not simply personal comforts. They represented what she understood to be her continuing relevance inside the institution she had sacrificed so much to serve. And for a long time, there was no formal reason to believe that relevance was under threat. Then came Windsor. The Commonwealth reception planning meeting had been called to coordinate arrangements for a major forthcoming event. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was expected to chair the Future Strategy Committee. It was not a surprising assignment. Her role in public engagement, youth outreach, and patronage reform had been growing steadily, and palace officials had come to rely on her in those areas with increasing confidence. But when the meeting convened, with King Charles and Prince William, the Prince of Wales, both present, the Queen consort objected. What she said in that room, directly, in front of the future king and his father, was not a quiet expression of concern. It was a direct challenge. There cannot be two queens directing this family while I am still here. Catherine did not argue. She closed her briefing folder, looked toward the monarch, and asked calmly whether her presence had become an obstacle. Charles did not answer immediately. His silence lasted only seconds, but those who were in the room would later say that it struck harder than anything he might have said aloud. Prince William pushed back his chair and made clear that his wife's future authority was not Camilla's to restrict. The king called for calm, but the atmosphere in that room had shifted in a way that no procedural courtesy could undo. What nobody in that meeting fully understood at the time was that those few minutes at Windsor were about to become the foundation of something far larger than any of them had anticipated. Charles, according to the documented record prepared for the succession files, returned that evening and requested the confidential transition papers. He wrote across the Windsor record 4 words: "Continuity requires clarity." Within 48 hours, constitutional advisors had been instructed to begin drafting the instrument that would determine not just how the next reign would begin, but who would be permitted to shape it. And yet, as significant as that decision was, it is what happened after the document was signed that revealed the true cost of what Charles had done. Because the people most affected by it had not yet read it. And when they did, the private reactions inside Buckingham Palace, Clarence House, and Adelaide Cottage told a story that the official language of the instrument could never fully contain. What Catherine found when she opened the envelope beside William would leave her completely still. What Camilla found inside Clarence House, reading alone, would cause her to push her chair back so sharply it struck the wall. And the sealed annex attached to the decree, the section deliberately withheld from the main text, contained a second set of clauses that neither woman had been told to expect. The full picture of what those pages contained, and what they set in motion, is where the story becomes something that goes far beyond a palace disagreement. It becomes a question about what the monarchy is truly willing to sacrifice in order to secure its own future. The sealed annex was not, as it turned out, a minor procedural addition. Constitutional advisors familiar with the mechanics of royal transition documents later described it as the most operationally significant section of the entire instrument, the part that would determine not simply who held authority in the next reign, but how that authority would actually function in practice. And what made the annex so consequential was not only what it granted Catherine, Princess of Wales, but what it simultaneously dismantled. Under the terms set out in that additional section, the future queen was given formal oversight of strategic planning, charitable patronage, youth engagement policy, and the direction of ceremonial reform as the monarchy moved toward the next reign. These were not honorary designations. They were working responsibilities, the kind of institutional authority that shapes how a royal household actually operates from day to day, how it speaks publicly, how it allocates resources, and how it positions itself in relation to the concerns of a changing country. Royal observers have noted that responsibilities of this scope are rarely codified so explicitly at this stage of a transition. The fact that they were committed to paper at all, with Charles's signature beneath them, suggests that the palace was not merely preparing for an eventual handover. It was, in the assessment of several analysts who have studied royal succession structures, actively accelerating one. The second clause of the annex extended that logic further. It formally blocked members of Camilla's household and her personal network of advisors from carrying influence into the next reign. A clause of this kind is, by any measure, unusual. Royal households are complex organisms, and the individuals who serve within them frequently carry continuity between reigns simply by remaining in post. Senior aides, private secretaries, trusted intermediaries, these are the people who preserve institutional memory and smooth the passage from one era to the next. To formally sever that network before the transition had even begun was, in the words of one constitutional commentator, a decision that went well beyond settling a personal disagreement. It was a structural intervention, and structural interventions of this magnitude do not emerge from a single confrontation at Windsor, however heated that confrontation may have been. Which raises a question that the palace has not addressed directly. How much of what was written into this document had been forming long before that reception planning meeting? Because the evidence, such as it is, points toward a longer and more deliberate process than the official narrative implies. Palace household assessments had been recording tensions between the two royal households for months before Windsor. Staff members had reportedly been receiving conflicting instructions from competing advisory circles. Patronage transfers, the formal reassignments of charitable connections from one royal to another, had, according to internal accounts, been delayed in ways that frustrated Catherine's expanding public program. Some royal watchers have suggested that Windsor was not the cause of the instrument but its occasion, the moment that gave Charles the formal justification to act on conclusions he had already privately reached. If that interpretation is correct, it changes the nature of the decision considerably. It means that what Charles signed was not a reactive measure taken in the aftermath of a difficult confrontation. It was the endpoint of a sustained institutional judgment, one that had been building quietly through documented assessments, private consultations, and recorded household reviews, and that Windsor simply made impossible to delay any further. The king's handwritten notation that evening, "Continuity requires clarity," reads differently under that interpretation. Not as a sudden resolution reached under pressure, but as the final acknowledgement of something he had been moving toward for some time. What is perhaps most revealing about this entire sequence is not the document itself, but the process that produced it. Charles did not move quickly. What Charles consulted was not simply a legal team. The recorded process, leading to the instrument, involved private household reviews, documented staff assessments, formal Commonwealth advisory consultations, and a series of one-on-one conversations that were preserved specifically for the succession files, meaning they were never intended to remain private in the long term. They were intended to become part of the official record of how this transition was managed. That is itself a significant detail. When a sovereign takes the deliberate step of ensuring that private conversations are formally archived, he is not simply making a decision. He is constructing a justification. He is building a documented case for why a decision of this magnitude was not only necessary, but defensible to history, to the institution, and eventually to the public. The question that raises is one that royal analysts have returned to repeatedly. Who was Charles most concerned about persuading? Because the instrument, as written, goes considerably further than the minimum required to settle a dispute over household authority. It does not simply clarify Catherine's future role. It formally structures the next reign's power architecture in ways that would be extraordinarily difficult to reverse without triggering the kind of institutional instability the document was ostensibly designed to prevent. Some royal commentators have pointed out that a sovereign concerned primarily with resolving a personal tension would have achieved that through private instruction and informal arrangement, as previous monarchs have done in comparable situations. The fact that Charles chose instead to create a formal, sealed, multiply archive constitutional instrument suggests that his concerns extended well beyond the immediate conflict at Windsor. Which brings into focus something that has received surprisingly little attention in discussions of the story: the Commonwealth dimension. The consultations that fed into the instrument's drafting were not limited to the palace's internal advisors. Formal discussions with representatives from Commonwealth nations, the voluntary association of countries that the British monarchy continues to serve as a symbolic and ceremonial institution, consistently identified Catherine as essential to the next reign's credibility in those communities. This matters more than it might initially appear, because the Commonwealth relationship has never been more structurally uncertain than it is at this particular moment in the monarchy's history. Several member nations have, in recent years, raised serious questions about the future of their royal ties. The monarchy's ability to remain relevant across those communities depends, in part, on its ability to present a future leadership that those communities can connect with. And the assessments that reach Charles's desk pointed, with unusual consistency, to one person. This introduces a dimension to the instrument that transforms it from a family document into something closer to a foreign policy one. If Catherine's elevation was seen internally not simply as the right outcome for a difficult household dispute, but as a strategic necessity for the monarchy's international standing, then the removal of competing influence from around her becomes less about personal preference and more about institutional clarity. An incoming queen who begins her role with her authority visibly contested, whose decisions are reliably second-guessed by a parallel network of advisors still carrying influence from the previous reign, is a queen whose public credibility is compromised before she has taken a single formal step. Royal observers have noted that this kind of divided authority is not merely uncomfortable, it is historically dangerous for monarchies that depend on the perception of unity to maintain their legitimacy. It is worth pausing on that word, legitimacy, because there is a broader argument embedded within the architecture of this instrument that has not yet been fully examined. Charles III inherited a monarchy navigating one of its most complex periods of public scrutiny. The years preceding his accession had produced departures, disputes, allegations, and a sustained public conversation about the monarchy's relevance that had, at various points, threatened to permanently alter the institution's relationship with large sections of the British public and with audiences far beyond Britain. Against that backdrop, the future reign does not simply need a capable queen. It needs a queen whose public standing is beyond internal challenge, someone whose authority within the household is so clearly established that the institution can present a unified face to a public that has grown increasingly sensitive to signs of dysfunction behind the palace doors. Seen in that light, the instrument is not primarily about Camilla at all. It is about the structural conditions required for William's reign to begin with the kind of authority that the monarchy's current position demands. Camilla's removal from the future governing structure is, in this reading, incidental to a larger design, a consequence of the instrument's purpose rather than its driving motivation. Some analysts have argued that this distinction matters enormously because it changes the moral weight of what Charles did. A king who acted primarily to diminish his wife's future influence is a different figure from a king who acted primarily to secure his son's reign and calculated that the two objectives could not simultaneously be achieved. Whether Charles himself experienced the decision in those terms is something only he and his closest advisors know. What the documented record reveals is that he spent weeks reviewing evidence, consulting widely, and considering alternatives before the instrument was drafted. That process of deliberation does not, on its own, tell us what weighed most heavily on him. But it does suggest that the decision was reached with a degree of care that is difficult to reconcile with the idea of a sovereign acting impulsively or out of personal preference alone. And yet there is one element of the recorded process that sits uncomfortably alongside that narrative of careful institutional reasoning, one detail that has quietly complicated the picture for those who have studied the timeline most closely. Because embedded within the succession files, beside the formal assessments and the constitutional advisor's recommendations, is a record of a private conversation between Charles and William that took place weeks before Windsor. A conversation in which the future king spoke clearly about what he believed the next reign required. A conversation that Charles later described, in the recorded account prepared for the archive, as the moment he understood that delay was no longer a responsible option. What William said in that room, and what it reveals about how much the prince already understood of what was being planned, may reframe everything that has been presented as Charles's decision alone. The private conversation between Charles and William that the succession files preserve is not described in full anywhere in the documents that have been reviewed. What is recorded is its outcome, the king's written acknowledgement that, following that exchange, he understood delay to be no longer responsible, and a single phrase attributed to the Prince of Wales that constitutional advisors later described as the clearest expression of the next generation's position they had encountered. William did not ask his father to act against Camilla. He did not request her removal. What he communicated, according to the archived account, was something more structural and, in some ways, more difficult to argue against. He told Charles that the next reign could not function beneath two competing centers of female authority, and that the longer the palace allowed that ambiguity to persist, the more damage it would do to Catherine's ability to begin her queenship with the credibility the institution required. That framing is important because it shifts the nature of William's intervention considerably. He was not, by this account, acting out of personal animosity or pursuing a private grievance. He was making an institutional argument, one that the evidence the palace had already gathered largely supported. And Charles, who had spent his own accession navigating the consequences of divided loyalty and competing advisory structures, was in a position to understand that argument with unusual clarity. Some royal analysts have suggested that William's choice to frame his concerns in institutional rather than personal terms was itself a signal of how seriously the future king had thought through the implications. It is considerably harder to dismiss an argument about the structural requirements of a functioning monarchy than it is to dismiss a family complaint. And it is considerably harder, once that argument has been made clearly and recorded formally, to continue treating inaction as a neutral option. What this reveals about the relationship between Charles and his son is something royal observers have found quietly significant. Because the version of events that circulated in the immediate aftermath of the instrument's signing, in which Charles acted unilaterally, motivated primarily by his own assessment of what the institution required, begins to look, under closer examination, like an incomplete account. Not an inaccurate one, necessarily, but one that omits a dynamic that the palace appears to have been careful not to emphasize. The sovereign signed the instrument. That much is beyond question. But the conditions that made signing it feel not just appropriate, but necessary had been shaped, at least in part, by a direct private conversation with the man who will eventually inherit everything the document is designed to protect. This raises a question that has not yet been fully answered. To what extent was the Crown Continuity Instrument the product of Charles's judgment, and to what extent was it a response to pressure, however respectfully and institutionally it was expressed, from the next generation? The distinction matters because it determines something important about where power inside the British monarchy currently resides. A sovereign who acts on his own analysis, informed by but not directed by his heir, is exercising authority in the way the constitutional position demands. A sovereign who formalizes in writing what his son has privately argued for, using the language and framework his son's position requires, is doing something subtly but meaningfully different. Royal commentators have been cautious about drawing that conclusion too directly, but several have noted that the timeline, the private conversation, followed weeks later by the instrument, invites the question, even if it does not definitively answer it. There is a historical dimension here that is worth considering carefully. The relationship between a reigning monarch and an heir who has waited a long time to inherit has never been a straightforward one, and the British monarchy has navigated its tensions with varying degrees of success across generations. What distinguishes the current situation from many historical parallels is the degree to which William has already, through public role and institutional presence, begun to function as a figure of independent authority. The Wales household is not simply a preparation for a future reign. It is, by any practical measure, already a parallel center of public engagement, charitable leadership, and strategic communication. That is not a criticism. It reflects the demands placed on the modern monarchy and the scale of work required to maintain its relevance. But it does mean that the relationship between Charles's reign and William's future one is closer, in structural terms, than the formal constitutional position might suggest. And it means that a document designed to smooth the transition between those two reigns is not simply planning for a distant future. It is managing a present reality that is already considerably more complex than the palace's public presentation has typically acknowledged. Against that backdrop, Camilla's position acquires a dimension that has rarely been explored openly. She was not simply caught between her husband's institutional priorities and his son's future requirements. She was caught between two phases of the monarchy that are, in some respects, already overlapping. Her influence was not being removed in anticipation of a transition that might lie years away. It was being removed in response to pressures that were already actively shaping the institution's direction. That is a meaningful difference, and it may explain why the instrument was drafted with a degree of permanence and structural reach that surprised even some of those involved in its preparation. This was not a holding measure. It was a settlement, one designed to resolve a tension that the palace had concluded could not be managed through informal arrangement or patient diplomacy any longer. What remains, genuinely unresolved, however, is the question of whether the instrument will achieve what it was designed to achieve. Because formal documents, however carefully worded, cannot fully govern the informal dynamics through which influence actually moves inside institutions. Senior advisors build relationships. Trusted individuals carry access that no clause can formally extinguish. And Camilla, whatever the instrument determines about her future authority, retains something that no constitutional framework can remove, the private ear of a king who loves her, for however long his reign continues. That private access, and what she chose to do with it in the days following the signing, may ultimately matter more to the story's outcome than anything written in the instrument itself. What Camilla chose to do with that private access in the days following the signing was not what many inside the palace had anticipated. Those who expected a sustained campaign, a determined effort to use her proximity to the king to quietly unpick what the instrument had established, found instead something more controlled and in some respects more strategically sophisticated. She did not immediately press Charles for reversal. She did not mobilize her household or instruct her advisors to mount a formal challenge. What she did, according to accounts that have since filtered through palace-adjacent sources, was wait. And in the particular architecture of royal power, waiting is rarely passive. It is frequently the most deliberate choice available. The significance of that restraint became clearer when the leak emerged. Because the appearance of a photographed paragraph from the instrument in the hands of a national broadcaster did not occur in a vacuum, and the timing, arriving before the palace had made any public statement about the document's existence, told its own story. Security officers traced the photograph page to a copier associated with one of Camilla's senior household aides. The aide's explanation, offered during a recorded internal interview, was that the copy had been made solely to obtain independent legal advice. That explanation was not, on its face, implausible. Senior royal staff routinely seek legal counsel when documents of constitutional significance affect their employers' positions. But the timing of when that copy was made, and the circumstances under which it appears to have left the palace's control, have led some observers to suggest that the leak served a purpose beyond the merely administrative. The effect of that single leaked paragraph was immediate and significant. Within the palace, it forced a decision that had been carefully managed as a private institutional matter into the domain of public accountability. Communications officials found themselves drafting responses under acute time pressure, weighing the risks of denial against the risks of confirmation, and calculating whether the story could be shaped before the broader details emerged. Outside the palace, it transformed what had been an internal succession arrangement into a national conversation about two women, two versions of royal purpose, and the question of what the monarchy owed to each of them. And that conversation, once started, could not be managed by press office language alone. What the leak also did, and this is perhaps its most consequential effect, was remove the palace's ability to control the sequence in which information reached the public. Charles had signed the instrument with a specific narrative in mind, a deliberate, carefully considered succession framework presented at a moment of the palace's choosing, in language that protected Camilla's dignity while establishing Catherine's future authority. The leak destroyed that sequencing entirely. Instead of a managed announcement, the public received a fragment, 11 words, stripped of context, without the careful framing that would have surrounded a formal disclosure. And 11 words, presented without context, in a story involving two women and a king's signature, were always going to be interpreted through the lens of competition, loss, and selection rather than institutional planning. The palace's decision not to retreat, Charles's refusal to withdraw the instrument even when a draft denial was placed before him, is the moment that transformed this from a crisis into a defining act. Royal commentators have noted that a different sovereign, facing the combination of a private leak, a wounded queen consort, and a national broadcaster asking questions, might have chosen to buy time through ambiguity. Charles did not. His stated reasoning, preserved in the household record, was that retreat would render the future crown appear negotiable, that any visible hesitation in the face of public pressure would signal to every competing interest inside and outside the palace that the instrument's authority could be eroded. That reasoning is constitutionally coherent. It is also, some analysts have observed, the reasoning of a man who understood that this particular decision, once made and once partially exposed, could only be undermined by the person who made it. And he was not willing to be that person. But the decision to hold firm introduced its own pressure because it meant that Catherine now carried something she had not asked to carry publicly, the status of a woman whose elevation had been forced into view before she had the opportunity to define it herself. She had spent her royal life cultivating the impression that her influence was earned organically through service and character rather than through formal designation. The instrument, and the circumstances of its exposure, threatened to reframe her in terms she found uncomfortable, not as a future queen who had grown into the role through dedication, but as a figure whose position had been secured through a document that simultaneously diminished another woman. Her request, in the aftermath of the leak, to meet Camilla privately, without advisors, without secretaries, without husbands present, was not simply a personal gesture. It was a deliberate attempt to recover the human dimension of a story that institutional language had stripped of it. That meeting, in the small garden room at Clarence House, lasted long enough to change something that no document could have changed on its own. Catherine's opening words, that she had not come to take anything, were not diplomatic formality. They were, by several accounts, the sentence that shifted the atmosphere entirely because they addressed directly the interpretation Camilla had been carrying since she first read the instrument alone. The queen consort had read the document as a verdict on the value of everything she had endured. Catherine's presence in that room, and the honesty with which she spoke about her own fear rather than her own elevation, offered something the instrument could not, the possibility that what had been taken from Camilla was not a judgment of her worth, but a consequence of circumstances that had become structurally impossible to resolve any other way. Camilla's decision to hand Catherine a handwritten statement of acceptance before leaving that room may prove to be the most consequential act of this entire sequence, not because it altered the formal terms of the instrument, but because it removed the one outcome that could have made the instrument's implementation genuinely damaging to the institution. A queen consort who publicly contested the document, who allowed her private grief to become an active political opposition to the next reign, would have created a division within the monarchy that no succession framework, however carefully written, could have contained. Her restraint did not restore what she had lost, but it gave Charles something essential: the ability to present what had happened not as a family rupture, but as a considered transition, accepted by everyone it affected, and therefore capable of serving the purpose for which it had been designed. Whether the British public will ultimately interpret these events through the lens of institutional necessity or personal cost depends, to a considerable degree, on what the palace chooses to emphasize in the months ahead. Both interpretations are defensible. Both are, in different ways, true. A decision can be institutionally necessary and personally brutal simultaneously, and the British relationship with its monarchy has always been shaped by an ability to hold both of those realities in mind at once. What the country witnessed, in the days following the instrument's exposure, was not simply a palace managing a crisis. It was a monarchy navigating the oldest challenge in its history, the question of how power moves between generations without destroying the relationships and the trust on which the institution depends. Charles had answered that question with a signature. Catherine had answered it with a sentence in a garden room. Camilla had answered it with a handwritten note placed quietly in another woman's hands. And William, who had spoken the words that made delay impossible, who had signed the receipt confirming he understood what his father had done, who had stood beside Catherine as the country absorbed the news, had answered it with silence. The careful, deliberate silence of a man who understands that the reign now taking shape around him will be defined not by what he says in moments like this, but by what he has the patience to allow others to understand on their own. The crown continuity instrument will remain in the transition box, sealed, for as long as Charles reigns. When the moment eventually comes for it to be opened and acted upon, the people most affected by its contents will have had years to find their own accommodation with what it means. Whether that accommodation holds, whether the careful architecture Charles constructed survives the unpredictable pressures of an actual transition, is something no document can guarantee, and no family conversation can fully settle in advance. What do you think? Was this a necessary act of institutional courage from a king who understood what the monarchy required, or does a decision of this permanence, made at a moment of personal conflict, carry risks that only time will reveal? The comment section is open, and on a question this complex, every perspective matters.
Once again, the Queen of Consorts surprises us, but not in a good way.
Made lurid and false claims about the royal family, which played on her fears and fueled paranoia.
There are moments in the life of a monarchy when a single decision cuts so deeply that no title, no ceremony, and no carefully worded palace statement can soften what has truly happened, and what King Charles III announced behind closed doors was precisely that kind of moment. Something had shifted inside the palace, and the people who knew this family best understood immediately that this was not a routine restructuring, not a quiet administrative change, and certainly not the kind of announcement that gets made unless every other option has already collapsed. The meeting had been arranged with unusual secrecy. Senior members of the royal family received word that morning, not through the normal channels, not through the layers of correspondence that typically govern palace communications, but through a direct summons that gave no explanation, only a time and a room. Advisors were asked to surrender their phones before entering. Guards stood beyond locked doors, and when the family gathered around the long table, the folders in front of them carried a name that none of them had expected to see written in that context: Camilla, Queen Consort. That detail alone should tell you something about how the story begins, because the woman whose name appeared on those folders had not simply arrived at her position through marriage. She had survived decades of public hostility, years of being cast as an outsider, and a level of scrutiny so unrelenting that most people in her position would have quietly retreated long before reaching the threshold of the palace. Instead, Camilla, Queen Consort, had endured, and she had arrived. And yet, inside that locked room, her future was about to be fundamentally rewritten by the one person who had always, without exception, defended her. What King Charles III announced that morning stunned, even those who had been watching the royal family most closely. The monarch declared that his wife would no longer carry out the duties and privileges attached to her position as queen, would no longer appear as the monarchy's leading female figure at ceremonial occasions, and would step back into a reduced private life, not temporarily, not pending review, but permanently for the remainder of his reign. No path back was offered, no formal review process was promised. The order, once signed, was irreversible. Prince William, the Prince of Wales, sat beside Catherine, Princess of Wales, as his father read through every sentence, and those inside the room later described him as visibly shaken, not because the decision surprised him entirely, but because watching the man who had carried the crown through illness, through personal grief, and through the long years of preparing for the throne struggle, through each word revealed something about the cost of that decision that no official statement would ever fully capture. William had seen his father endure things privately that most people never learned about publicly, but this was different. This was a wound that had come from within. Catherine remained still beside her husband, though people who knew her well would have recognized immediately that she was already calculating what the announcement would mean, not for herself, but for the position she now occupied in the aftermath of it. And then there was Princess and the Princess Royal, who sat at that table without visible emotion, watching her brother, and who noticed something the others may have missed, that beneath the declaration Charles was reading, there was another page, held beneath his hand, deliberately kept from view. The Princess Royal said nothing in that moment, but she had seen enough of palace life to understand that when a king conceals a document at a family meeting, the reason hidden inside it is almost always more significant than the decision being announced aloud. To understand why Charles reached this point, why a man who had spent more than 2 decades publicly defending Camilla ultimately signed a declaration that reduced her world to private rooms and protected residences, you have to go back to a moment that most people outside the palace never heard about at all. A moment that did not begin with a confrontation, a raised voice, or a formal accusation, but with something far quieter and far more deliberate than that. It began with a chair, and by the time the full story of that chair became clear to everyone gathered in that locked room, they understood that what looked on the surface like a dispute over seating at a closed ceremony had, in fact, been the moment when the tension between the current queen and the future one became something the monarchy could no longer privately manage or publicly ignore. What happened inside that ceremony, and who made the decision that started the collapse, will tell you everything about how the most powerful family in Britain arrived at the most painful morning it had faced in years, and why the consequences of that one quiet act are still reshaping the royal household today. The chair at Windsor Castle had not been placed there by accident, and everyone who later reviewed the sequence of events understood that almost immediately. What made the moment significant was not the act itself. Senior royals have navigated questions of precedence and ceremonial positioning for centuries, but the precision of it. The central chair at that closed investiture planning meeting had not simply been available when Camilla, Queen Consort, arrived. It had been specifically reserved, in writing, through a sealed instruction from King Charles III himself, and the seating cards confirming Catherine's name in that position had been quietly replaced before the meeting began. Someone had prepared this before anyone else entered the room. That distinction matters enormously, because it transformed what could have been interpreted as a misunderstanding into something that carried an entirely different weight, a deliberate choice, made in advance, in full knowledge of what the king had ordered. Princess, and the Princess Royal, was the one who eventually placed that distinction in front of her brother in documented form, and royal observers who have since studied the sequence of events have noted that her decision to do so may have been the moment that made everything else inevitable, and had not simply witnessed the Windsor incident and reported it. She had gathered a file, documented records of earlier instructions altered, delayed, or quietly reinterpreted by members of Camilla's household, and presented it alongside the replaced seating cards as evidence of a pattern rather than a single isolated act. The question that raises is one the palace has never directly addressed. How long had that pattern been developing before Windsor made it visible enough to document? Charles had feared something like this for longer than most people realized. Those closest to the king have suggested that his concern was not simply about ceremony or precedence, but about something more fundamental. The risk that 2 competing households, with different interests, different priorities, and different visions of the monarchy's future, were beginning to operate in parallel rather than in alignment. A monarchy depends on a single, unambiguous line of authority, and the king had watched with growing unease as decisions around ceremonial appointments, household staffing, and royal patronages reflected competing priorities rather than a shared institutional direction. Camilla's household had pressed for loyal figures to retain positions close to the ceremonial center. Charles needed clarity as William and Catherine moved closer to the throne. The collision of those two pressures had been building quietly for some time before Windsor gave it a face. What Camilla said when Charles confronted her privately after the ceremony revealed exactly how deep that tension ran. She told him, in a recorded palace account, that she would not become invisible simply because the next generation was impatient. That single phrase carried more significance than it might initially appear to, because it suggested she had already framed the situation not as a question of institutional duty, but as a personal struggle for survival, and that framing made compromise considerably more difficult to reach. The king had not been asking her to disappear. He had been asking her to respect the instructions of a sovereign. But in her mind, some royal watchers have argued, those two things had become indistinguishable from each other. Charles heard more than defiance in her answer. He heard a warning that his marriage and the succession were no longer moving in the same direction. And for a monarch who had spent decades understanding better than almost anyone the consequences of allowing personal relationships to compete with constitutional responsibility, that warning was not something he could absorb and then set quietly aside. The confrontation in the king's private study, when it finally came, was described by those who later reviewed the account as one of the most significant private moments in the palace in years, not because of what was said in anger, but because of what was revealed in its absence. Charles did not raise his voice. He placed the altered seating plan on the desk between them and waited, and when Camilla admitted she had known Catherine's name was meant to occupy that chair, the final defense that her actions had been born of confusion rather than intention was no longer available to her. What replaced it was something more complicated, her argument that surrendering every visible sign of seniority would reduce her to a queen in name only, a position she had fought too long and endured too much to accept. That argument deserves careful consideration, because it illuminates something about the impossible position she occupied, and some observers have pointed out that her fear was not entirely without foundation. The transfer of ceremonial responsibilities to Catherine, Princess of Wales, was not simply an administrative adjustment. Each reassigned engagement, each replaced name on a public schedule, each charity informed that a different royal would now represent the crown at future events was a public signal, visible to the country, legible to institutions, and permanent in the record of the reign. The question of whether those transfers were inevitable regardless of Windsor, or whether they were directly accelerated by what happened there, is one that analysts have continued to examine without reaching a definitive answer. What is clear is that by the time Charles signed the declaration reducing his wife's role, he understood precisely what he was choosing between, and that the choice itself would raise questions about the monarchy that no single announcement could settle. Because reducing Camilla's position did not simply resolve the tension inside the palace. It transferred that tension somewhere else entirely, and the person it landed on most directly was the one who had never asked for any part of this conflict to begin with. Catherine, Princess of Wales, had not asked for a single one of the responsibilities now arriving at her door, and the people around her understood that the manner in which they arrived mattered just as much as the responsibilities themselves. When the revised schedule was placed before her at the family meeting, her name appearing beside ceremonies Camilla had expected to lead, her presence now required at occasions from which she had previously stood at a respectful distance, the princess went still in a way that William recognized immediately. It was not reluctance, and it was not ambition. It was the careful calculation of someone who understood that in the court of public opinion, the difference between inheriting a role and appearing to have engineered it can be invisible, and that invisibility is precisely what makes it dangerous. Every new duty transferred to Catherine carried within it the potential to be read as evidence of something that had never occurred, that she had wanted this, that her household had positioned for it, that the woman now stepping into Camilla's ceremonial space had in some way contributed to the circumstances that created the vacancy. Prince William, the Prince of Wales, understood that risk with absolute clarity, and his response to it revealed something important about how the heir to the throne had been thinking about the monarchy's future for considerably longer than this particular crisis. He did not simply instruct his team to avoid celebrating. He actively resisted the idea that any of Catherine's expanded responsibilities should be framed as appointments, upgrades, or signs of a shifting hierarchy. The future king wanted the transfer to appear precisely as it was, an institutional necessity rather than a personal advancement, because he knew that the moment it looked like anything else, the story would no longer be about Camilla's decisions at Windsor. It would become a story about Catherine's ambitions, and that reframing, once established in the public imagination, is extraordinarily difficult to reverse. That strategic instinct points towards something analysts of the royal household have been discussing with increasing seriousness over the past several years, the degree to which William and Catherine have been quietly and methodically preparing for the transition of power in a way that is deliberately designed to look like no preparation at all. The couple have consistently positioned themselves as supportive of the current reign, deferential to its priorities, and uninterested in accelerating a future that will arrive in its own time. Yet that positioning has itself required considerable strategic thought, and royal observers have noted that the careful management of perception around Catherine's expanding role in the aftermath of this announcement reflected exactly the kind of institutional sophistication that suggests the Wales household has been thinking about these dynamics for some time. What complicates that picture is that Camilla's fears, however they manifested at Windsor, were not entirely disconnected from reality. The gradual transfer of ceremonial weight toward the next generation is not simply an inevitable consequence of time. It is, in part, a deliberate institutional process, one that reflects decisions made at the level of palace planning about how the monarchy presents itself to a country that has changed considerably since the last transition of power. Charles III came to the throne understanding better than almost anyone the pressures a modern monarchy faces, questions about relevance, about public value, about the sustainability of an institution that depends on continuous public consent, and some royal watchers have argued that his handling of the succession has been shaped by those pressures in ways that are not always visible from the outside. Against that backdrop, the question of whether Camilla was reacting to something real or something imagined becomes considerably more complex. If the transfer of ceremonial authority toward Catherine was always going to accelerate as the Wales household moved closer to the throne, then the Queen Consort's attempt to resist it, however misjudged in its execution, reflected an understanding of the institutional forces at work that was not simply paranoid. The problem was not that her analysis was entirely wrong. The problem was that her response to it placed her in direct opposition to the sovereign's explicit instructions, and in a constitutional monarchy, that distinction is not a technical formality. It is the foundation upon which everything else rests. Princess, and had understood that for decades, and her decision to present the documented evidence to Charles, rather than absorb it quietly, or counsel her sister-in-law privately, or allow the pattern to continue without formal record, revealed something about her own reading of the situation that deserves attention. The Princess Royal has spent her entire public life demonstrating that royal duty is not a matter of personal preference, and those who know her well have suggested that she watched the Windsor incident not simply as a family disagreement, but as a constitutional problem, one that, if left unaddressed, would create a precedent that could outlast the current reign. And was not protecting William and Catherine. She was protecting the principle that the sovereign's authority is not negotiable regardless of the relationship between the parties involved, and she was doing so at a moment when that principle appeared to be under genuine pressure. That reading of Anne's role adds a layer to the story that the initial shock of Charles's announcement tends to obscure. This was not simply a husband making a painful decision about his wife. It was an institution responding to a challenge to its own coherence, and the fact that the challenge came from within the immediate royal family, rather than from outside it, was precisely what made the response so significant and so irreversible. Because precedents set within royal families do not simply resolve the situation that created them. They travel forward in time, and they shape how future situations are interpreted when they arise. Charles's decision to issue a formal, permanent declaration rather than seek a private resolution established something that will now exist in the institutional record of this reign, a documented moment when the monarchy chose succession over sentiment, duty over love, and constitutional clarity over the preservation of personal dignity. What remains genuinely unclear, And what the public announcement, for all its finality, did not fully address, is whether the forces that created this crisis were ever confined to the relationship between Charles and Camilla, or whether they reflect something considerably broader about the pressures now operating at the very center of the British monarchy. And if it is the latter, then the events at Windsor may have been less of a cause than a catalyst. The moment a longer-running structural tension finally became impossible to manage quietly, forcing the institution to make visible a choice it had perhaps been postponing for far longer than anyone has yet acknowledged. The announcement reached the public before most people inside the palace had fully absorbed what it meant, and the speed of that transition, from private family reckoning to national news, created a pressure that no carefully worded statement could entirely contain. Britain woke to something it had not experienced in precisely this form before. The monarchy had weathered abdications, divorces, public scandals, and the loss of a sovereign. But what Charles III had now placed on record was constitutionally and personally distinct from any of those moments, because it did not involve the removal of someone who had failed publicly or departed of their own choosing. It involved a king formally and permanently reducing the role of a woman who remained his wife, remained legally queen consort, and remained living within the same private world the Declaration had just restructured around her. The country was being asked to process something that had no clean historical template, and the absence of that template meant that every commentator, every institution, and every member of the public was, in effect, interpreting the same set of facts without a shared framework for understanding them. That interpretive vacuum did not remain empty for long. Within hours of the announcement, two entirely coherent but fundamentally incompatible narratives had established themselves in public discourse, and the distance between them revealed something important about the pressures now converging on the monarchy from multiple directions simultaneously. The first framing presented Charles as a sovereign who had demonstrated precisely the kind of constitutional clarity a modern monarchy requires, a king who understood that personal loyalty cannot override institutional responsibility, and who had made an extraordinarily painful decision because the alternative was a precedent that could destabilize the succession itself. The second framing presented him as a husband who had publicly dismantled his wife's dignity in a manner that raised serious questions about the values the institution claimed to represent, and whether a monarchy built on the language of duty and continuity could survive being seen to treat the person closest to the sovereign as an asset to be restructured when politically convenient. Both of those narratives carried genuine weight, and the fact that they were simultaneously credible created a problem for the palace that goes considerably beyond the management of a single news cycle. Institutions that depend on public trust cannot easily sustain prolonged periods in which large portions of the population hold contradictory but equally defensible interpretations of their decisions. The longer that ambiguity persists without resolution, the more it tends to harden into permanent division, and royal commentators have noted that the palace's decision not to issue a detailed explanation of the reasoning behind the declaration may have been designed to prevent the story from escalating further, but may in practice have achieved precisely the opposite effect by leaving the interpretive space open for narratives the institution cannot control. William understood that dynamic with particular